What happens when the journeys of customers, technology, and business intersect? Product happens. Welcome to Product Management Show, where we talk about the journeys of customers, the journeys of technology, and the journeys of business, and what happens when they all intersect at the crossroads we call product.
What would you say you do here? You take the specifications from the customers and you bring them down to the software engineers. Yes, that's right.
I'm working, so why don't you go do whatever it is a product manager does?
When you think about focusing, right? You think, well, focusing is saying yes, no. Focusing is about saying no. Focusing is about saying no. And you've got to say no, no, no. And when you say no, you piss off people.
You just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem. Then you solve the next one. And then the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 40 of the Product Management Show. Whether you work in product management or with product management, or maybe you were just curious or confused about product management, then you are in the right place. In this episode, we welcome back Saeed Khan, Bonnell and Neeha Thumala. This episode is a serious follow-up to our episode 39 humorous debate on Waterfall versus Agile. We set humor aside this time and discuss Waterfall versus Agile more fully and more seriously. Listeners note, this is a long-form episode, about 62 minutes of content, and will pair nicely with a long commute, a short flight, several loads of laundry, or a mild case of insomnia. PDM principle number 40 is borrowed from Rich Rogers. Agility is not about speed. Agility is about navigating ambiguity and adapting to change. Enjoy the show. All right, folks, welcome back. We're doing part 2 of our discussion on Waterfall versus Agile. And our first part was a humorous look at the topic. So certainly check that out if you haven't yet. And in this second part, we have a more serious discussion. So we've got here our guests, Saeed Khan, what we like to call the maverick of product marketing metrics. Welcome, Saeed Khan.
Thanks, Alan.
And we have his business partner and longtime product management expert, Bonnell. Welcome, Bonnell.
Thank you, Alan. Were you going to call me Goose, by the way, if he's Maverick, or?
No, I was going to call you Bonnell, actually.
Oh, okay, just checking.
And then to round things out and representing kind of the student or the practitioner here is Neeha Thumala. So welcome, Neeha Thumala.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to throw out a couple questions just to get the discussion going. So first one is, setting aside all the joking from our first discussion, is one method between these two really better than the other? Who wants to start off our comments on that one?
Yeah, it's Lee here. I'll start out if that's
all
okay.
Right. Go for it.
Yeah, for sure. So putting aside all the dogma that we joked a lot about, I think both ways can be very successful. But generally speaking, the larger the project, the better Agile seems to be when you compare the two and the results. I know Waterfall definitely has a bit of a solid reputation, back in the 90s, et cetera, all these huge ERP projects, the SAPs, the SAP, the PeopleSofts of the world, et cetera. Again, those often, went to, double the time, double the budget, blah, 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 and really kind of damaged the reputation, if you will. Then Agile came in and seemed to be the savior to a degree. But again, I think you might have mentioned before the chaos report by the Standish Group. They actually did some research on this. If we want to be data driven, we can look at their results. And they did a 2015 report. They measured, I think, 10,000 projects in over a 4-year period. And they did the research, and it did show that for all projects, that Agile definitely was more successful. Not to say there wasn't challenged and failed projects in Agile, but definitely the success rate was markedly better. And if you break that down into size of projects, the small size projects seem to be about the same, to be honest, which is no surprise, I guess. But the bigger you went, the higher the scale, the greater the ability for Agile to be more successful than Waterfall. So again, that seemed to sort of, this data-driven stuff seems to prove that Agile does have an edge over Waterfall for various reasons.
Nice. Saeed, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. This data from the chaos report. There's a couple of interesting data points to look at. So one of the things is that if from their numbers, when you look at small waterfall projects, they view 44% as successful, and then 45% they call challenged, which is some measure of not quite successful, but definitely not a failure. But as soon as you go up to a medium project, that 44% drops down to 7%, and then when you go to large, it drops down to 3% in terms of successful projects, right? Which is just kind of like almost nothing. The data to me is kind of strange when they say that 44% of small projects succeed, and yet only 7% of medium projects succeed. So and then on the other hand, you get 58% of agile projects succeed when they're small, and 27, about half that number succeed when they're medium. And so I kind of looked at it and said, okay, I don't know what the data is. I don't know I'm not going to kind of challenge your data. There's something really weird with that huge drop off in small to medium waterfall projects. And then the only thing I can think of is that in general, software developers are terrible at estimating projects because it doesn't matter how much estimating, which method they use, waterfall or agile, the vast majority of projects don't succeed. So I think there's some other factors that really need to be looked at in terms of why so many of these projects don't succeed. Like even with large projects, 18% of agile projects are successful, which is terrible. That means 80% roughly are not successful. So maybe some more research is required, but there's something else that really needs to be addressed. Waterfall and agile both don't do well when you get to large projects.
Yeah, it's interesting side on those large project side. I remember I was quite shocked when I was working at a large company that did mobile software, and we had this big presentation with our VP of QA. That's when QA had their own department, I guess. And his statement was, he asked us all, what do you think the rework was on our big projects? And we all said, 30%, maybe 40%. That's outrageous. And after we all guessed, he said, you're all wrong. It's 400%. So you work all day Monday, and then you spend Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to fix what you did on Monday. So that was his take on this big enterprise type of project and how difficult it was to get this thing working effectively and efficiently. So interesting.
And Neeha, I know last time you mentioned that you've worked in both waterfall type projects and you're doing agile now. Does this match with your experience or in the field? Or
wow, I mean, those stats sound super scary, and I'm working on projects right now, and I'm already thinking, I should look at my factors to success for sure. I think my experience has been that if a project is large, if it's high risk from a from a customer's perspective or the stakeholders involved, then typically it's always been waterfall. And I think a big reason has to do with just being able to sign off requirements or get some kind of like legally binding document that this is what is going to be delivered. So for kind of the business or the customer to have knowledge that I know exactly what is going to be delivered. So that's been one aspect. But in terms of execution, and currently I'm definitely like using Agile, I do like that, you can kind of hit the ground running. And I agree. I think in general, all of my projects around estimation have been terrible. I don't think anyone's really good at estimation. But just to not, wait for figuring out, this entire epic, but instead to pick a first set of stories, get to the level of clarity and continuously execute at the same time. It's something that's really nice. I really like it, but I know that that's not necessarily working for my customers. So I'm right now in between, I guess. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's dig into Agile now, and I'll turn to you maybe to start. Saeed, what are some of the limits of Agile, do you think?
So I think the limits are similar in the sense that to Waterfall, in the sense that like Neeha just touched on estimation, right? I think estimation is a challenge for anyone, regardless of what methodologies they use, and I think part of it is that there's so many unknowns when it comes to software development, right? Like you're not starting from scratch in any software development project. You're always building on something, right? Whether it's a framework or some other tooling or some other code that's already been written by somebody else. And I think that a lot of times, this idea that Neeha had of starting and hit the ground running, I think that's good, except that you don't know what you don't know, right? So I have one story from a customer I worked with where they were going to build some new application and they had some new infrastructure. They analyzed a bunch of vendors. They found the one that they wanted and they were going to build on top of it. And then they started their development, and then they found bugs in the software that they had purchased. They found limitations that they weren't aware of. They realized there were technical constraints, and then there, they had a lack of proper training that they realized after the fact, even though they went through all the vendor approved training. So, whether they're agile or not, those kind of things happen all the time. And I think that, some people might say agile helps you overcome them because you're constantly learning. But I think when you hit barriers like that, it doesn't matter how you're moving forward, you're going to have to hit some other gas pedal or do something else to figure out how to move forward and make progress. So that's not an agile limitation per se, but I think that, a lot of times people look at agile as a panacea. Oh, well, it's not waterfall, therefore it's gonna solve their problems, and I don't think that's true.
So I'll just mention before we move on, we'll post some of the graphs and some of that research data that we were mentioning earlier online with this episode. But maybe just for the one or two people that are maybe living in caves or under rocks somewhere. Lee or Saeed, can maybe one of you just give us a backgrounder to make sure we're on the same page in terms of the history of Agile?
Sure, I'll do it quickly. So Agile, the principles of Agile, and I'll get to them in a second. But the principles of what became Agile were kind of originally described in, from my perspective, an HBR article from back in 1986, if you can believe it. And there were these two Japanese researchers, and they had an article, and it was called The New Development Game. And in it, they talked about this new way of developing products. And they had concepts like self-organizing teams that move forward together, as opposed to handing off things, from team to team and phase to phase. They talked about ongoing learning, and then a different way of managing that was not a top-down command and control method. And they were working with companies like Epson, HP, Honda, and Xerox, and these companies were using this method to actually create new products, and they were seeing real benefits from it. So that in my opinion is sort of where this new type of development methodology started. And it wasn't really until 2001 that the Agile Manifesto itself came to being, where a bunch of software developers met up in a resort in Utah and came out with the super short Agile Manifesto, right, with the 4 principles and I think the 12 underlying facts, or I forget the term for it. But that's sort of the history. And then it's taken a while. We're 16 years from the Agile Manifesto, and of course now things are very different. But it took a while to really catch on and make headway.
Yeah, and that can be found at agilemanifesto.org. So maybe let's just have a quick discussion on each of the 4 principles that they talk about there. So, it starts off with individuals and interactions over process and tools. And Neeha, I'm going to start with you on this one, just to change it up a bit. So is that how you operate on a day-to-day basis? Do you and your team value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, or is that maybe an oversimplification of the real world?
Yeah, I think it's definitely challenging because, for a growing company, there's so much willingness to adopt Agile, truly, so we have Scrum Masters, we have the ceremonies, we have these processes, but sometimes it's almost like it's a growing startup. We're still in that startup frame of mind, and it almost feels like everything that Agile has to offer in order to implement it truly is just too much. Sometimes you're just like, why can't I just throw half of this out of the door and spend more time on actually doing work, And it feels like maybe some of this stuff is better for a larger kind of more enterprise setting. And so sometimes I find that in a sprint, there's so much, in terms of ceremony or process, or actually even configuring the tools, providing access, that I do question if I take a step back as to, is this really pushing me towards productivity, and what is this really accomplishing? So I think it heavily has to do with like the size of the organization, the pressure that there is for delivery, the length of sprints, all of these things. I mean, sometimes you just gotta like throw out the process. And I feel like, Agile is great in terms of what's there, but for me, I have to adopt it to what is feasible for me in my situation. And for me, if that means like throwing out half of the stuff, and I want to be able to do that, it's just a tool. So I want to choose from this toolkit. So what's relevant to me.
Cool.
But I do feel like the methodology gives me a great, it's a great methodology for execution. That's how I look at it. That's about it. Use what you can and lose the rest.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in if that's great. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like about that first one is that it does, the whole point of that is to engage the developers, right? Rather than the top-down stuff where people are told what to do and they got to follow it and they're a big cog of the machine. The idea that of the whole agile bottom-up stuff is that it's more engaging. It's more people feel more part of the system, and that they're actually driving it. So I think what I had seen with my teams is that it does engage them more, and they just again, and I think that ends up getting increasing productivity and engagement, which is a good thing, right? So that's what I like about Agile, just that sense of engagement, because people are in there and you're working together as a team and getting stuff done. So that's what I think is so important about that first one from my perspective.
Well, one thing I'll add actually is that, and it's important to keep this in mind, that this Agile manifesto was created in response to problems that these individuals saw, right, in software development. And so the wording of the manifesto itself is important. I think a lot of times people lose sight of that, right? So they say individuals and interactions over process and tools, but in the sort of preamble to the manifesto, they make clear that process and tools are important, but you shouldn't let that become your focus. You should really focus on individuals and interactions, right? And each of the four main principles are worded that way. But I think what happens, unfortunately, is that in some of them, like working software over comprehensive documentation, it actually becomes working software over documentation of any kind, right? So I think a lot of times people don't really understand what's really being said. And then the only other thing I'll say is that, there is literally no Agile methodology, right? There are methodologies like Scrum and Kanban, et cetera, that are based on Agile. And so when people say we're going Agile, and then they talk about sprints, iterations, and story points, and this, they're actually talking about something that's an implementation of Agile, right? And so I think those are things. So what Neeha said, I think, is valid, right? Is you do what works, right? You take a pragmatic approach, and really the goal is to get the job done. And if you don't really adopt exactly one methodology or another, there's nothing wrong with that if it's the right approach for your business or your teams.
Yeah, and these are principles. So let's quickly go through the other three. You've already mentioned working software with documentation. So Lee Bonnell, what do you think? Do people still do documentation, or is it all about the software now?
As I said, they're both valuable, but one has more predominance, right? So again, you want to write code. I mean, it's all about writing code, but code that works. So working software, and again, I think that every iteration you have working software that you can actually, the ideal is that you can actually launch that right to the marketplace. So and that the other benefit of that, it just feels good. You're actually delivering something that's working, right? But obviously you got to document this. Users have to use it, and you have to be able to know how to use it. So I mean, it's all important. But working software, absolutely, you got to get out there and make it work.
So Neeha, as our practitioner there, how do you and your team and your company score on this one? Do you find that you're focusing more on working software than documentation, or is there still a lot of documentation?
Actually, there's none. There's like no documentation. Having said that, I think we've realized that it doesn't have to be in a formal document, right? So I think people think it's an extreme, that documentation means, your Word document divided into headers and sections, and it doesn't have to be so formal. For me, I find that, even if it's informal documentation, does it give you the information that it need for, let's say, a developer to get started? I mean, does it clearly articulate the requirement? And then the second part is just for where, there's so much knowledge, and different developers, let's say, need to access that information, and the company is growing and new people are coming in, and that knowledge sharing aspect is somehow a little difficult. Documentation really helps there. So things like issue resolution, component is built and then there's no documentation, and then 6 months later it breaks, and those people that built it left, and it's like, what is this? What is the purpose of this? You don't even know, and you're sort of chasing this needle in the haystack situation. So even if that documentation is a wiki, which is accessible, shareable, it's being built over time, it's informal, but it's live, and it's cross-function. It's not just a developer tool. It includes business context as well. So I guess it's a little messy and not clean and not dirty, but it's functional. So that's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, cool. All right, so we'll hit the last two up quickly and then move on. So I'll just open up to all three of you. So the third one is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I mean,
Sure.
Again, in response to the waterfall way, which was let's agree on everything up front.
Yep.
And sign in blood and then stick to that plan until till the death march ends. It's really in response to that, right? It's work with whoever we're building things for, and we need to have some kind of back and forth communication process so we can figure things out. So that one is, I think, in my opinion, literally the most pragmatic one of all of these, because I think it's the one that actually is followed the most as well.
Well, yeah, and the key thing is you want to build the right product, right? It's easy to build some great stuff, but if it doesn't align with the solution the customer actually wants, then it's all not good, right? So I love this one too, because you actually will help you to build the right product that the market or the customer expects.
Cool. And the last one here is responding to change over following a plan. We've already probably mentioned that a little bit, talking about collaboration, but any thoughts on that principle, maybe Neeha? You guys do a lot of formal planning, or is it more change management on the fly?
That word, planning. So difficult. I think I honestly think that should probably be its own topic in itself, because it's so confusing and it's so challenging. So planning in the context of, how do we plan, like organizationally, what are the priorities? How does that trickle down into the projects that we're doing? And in terms of release management and engaging architecture, and, so I'm also in this phase where, the company is sort of becoming more mature. And as it becomes mature, then I guess the planning processes are also maturing, but that is a huge struggle. And honestly, I have no idea what's going on. Let's put it that way. But cool. I think what we are operating on is, here's a project, here's a client commitment, and here's a go live date. Nice. And it's still very much that. And how much we can plan in that context, I'm not really sure, So that would be, actually, that's my question. What do you do when it's just around go live dates? It's around a customer says, yeah, this is what we want, and we need to be live by this date. I don't care, Agile, Waterfall, whatever, do whatever you want, but these are my requirements.
So I think that this one is one of the ones that's really problematic, right? So first of all, responding to change or following a plan does not mean we don't plan. It means that we make a plan, but then we will respond to change if changes are required.
Agreed.
To answer Neeha's question, if we took this example and put it in the real world and said, look, you're going to build me a house and I need that house in 2 weeks, I don't really care what it takes. The builder would probably look at them and walk away, and they go, that's not possible, or we can build your house, it's just not going to be the house you want. Here's a little shack, you can live in it. And I think the same kind of reality check has to happen in software, in that if something is unreasonable or not doable, then you have to be able to look at someone and say, this is not going to work, and it's not going to work for you, Mr. Customer. It's not that we can't do something, we probably could, but it's not going to be what makes you successful. And I think that's really the challenge. I think a lot of times people who make those kind of demands are not aware of what it takes to build an application that they want. And there's power in saying no, and if people have to do that, then they should do that. And it's better for both parties, not just the person who's going to write the software.
Yeah, so I agree with Neeha. Sorry to cut you off there, Neeha. We could probably spend a whole podcast on this, but yeah, I'm tempted just for the humor value to ask Neeha how often she says no on a
That was going to be my follow-up question. So you know what? I do say no a lot, and I'm not very popular for it. But having said that, and that was going to be my second kind of more real question, which is, for someone in my role at the level that I am at, there is sometimes scope to say no, and sometimes there just isn't. The project has been committed to, the dates have been committed to, without necessarily clarity as to the how, but the what and the when has been agreed upon, between these two parties organizationally. And it trickles down to someone at my level. And frankly, it just, I mean, of course, there's some, back and forth, and there's definitely some pushback that is there, but like, I know that I have to get it done. So what would you recommend in terms of, okay, it's already happening, but in terms of execution, any recommendations around maybe a blend of, the two approaches? What do you suggest? Because I'm sure it's a common problem for a lot of people.
So I'll just say, yeah, and I can say this because I'm not in your shoes, right? I think that you have to teach these people who are making these commitments what really is required to get these things done. Like, it's easy for someone to commit someone else's time to do something, but if they have no skin in the game, then you're going to continue having this problem. I think if you're in your position, the thing you can do is day one, right? Let's say you start working on it, start involving them, right? Make them have some skin in the game. Start involving them in at least an understanding of what needs to be done, how it can be done, and what the trade-offs are. And then early on, they can actually get a sense of reality, use that information to reposition things with their client or to figure out what's going on. But if someone asks you to do the impossible and your answer is okay, the obligation is on you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true.
Lee, why don't you answer that as well? Because I think it's a very common question that Neeha's asking here.
Oh, absolutely. It would happen to me all the time. Yeah, by the way, I never say no. I just say yes, but later. So, unless it was just not the right thing. So, no, yeah. So this is a top-down thing where people want to have these plans and have these things set in stone. And you guys might have heard this iron triangle concept, right? Where there's a scope, resources, and time, and those are all fixed, and that's what you've got to work with, right? One might give away to others, but that kind of aligns you in the sand, right? But again, as we said way at the start of this, you don't know what you don't know, and then all this other stuff pops out that creates more scope and more work. But I really did like what Saeed said, is like get them involved. I mean, the good thing about Agile is you can see progress. It does allow visibility through dashboards, etc. And the key thing is you want to get you want to make people feel successful, and all you can do is get them to work as hard as they can to get to that finish line. It doesn't help just to have tension and shout and yell. That it won't do anything. So again, I think the visibility is good. You've got to manage up very well with Agile to make sure that they're aware of it and they can see the progress, etc. I mean, these people are not slacking. They're working really hard. I know one of my companies I work for that even with this, we were very agile. Even with this, we did actually end up having people to come in weekends and nights to reach a target date. So you can play, and that's the resources, right? That you throw onto it extra, but it did help. But it made the upper ups feel better. But it certainly did put a strain on the developers who are already working really hard. So.
Yeah, and we'll move on, but Neeha, yeah, maybe we'll do a focus session just on kind of the internal aspects of managing expectations, because like you say, I think we could do a whole session on that. But good comments, guys. So we talked about Agile as the 4 founding principles, shall we say, and then Saeed, I want to go back to what you were saying, which is, those are principles, they're not methodologies, but there has been some dominance in terms of methodology. So do you want to introduce that for us in terms of what the leading methodology is and how that plays into this?
Sure. So, there's a bunch of research by the Agile Alliance and other people on, what teams are working on. And so one of the results came from the State of Scrum report from the Scrum Alliance, sorry, not the Agile Alliance. And 89% of respondents said they're using Scrum. Now, people could have multiple. And so the second most common one was Kanban with 43%. And then some hybrid of Waterfall and some Agile was 23%, et cetera. And I mean, everything down to extreme programming and other things are sort of the long tail. But certainly Scrum is the dominant methodology by far.
Okay. And just for our listeners to level set, so, can and maybe Lee, you can take this one, but what are some of the key aspects of Scrum? How do I know if I'm doing Scrum? Let's put it that way.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess I'd point you to Jeff Sutherland's site. He actually wrote a report about Scrum, and he defines it. He's kind of like the godfather of Scrum, if you will.
Okay.
And he was one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, so Jeff Sutherland. So Google him, and he actually has written out Scrum and how one should do it, right? With the ceremonies, all the teams, and how all that works. So it's very well defined. So yeah, like Scrum again is very well defined with everything, and it does help to have that process. I hate to say it, and structure about it, because that does help people understand where to go. And the key thing too is to have Scrum Masters and make sure that you actually follow the Scrum. One of the biggest problems I've seen with it in the companies I work for is that you call yourself Agile and maybe you use Scrum, but you don't really do it well. So again, that's one of the biggest issues I see with it, and not being successful, is that people don't practice it properly. They just kind of use it, and maybe sometimes they use that to sell. I'll give you an example. One of the companies I work for is that we were having troubles. This top-down stuff from the executives, and we weren't getting it. We weren't meeting our commitment. So we said we would go Agile. We ended up buying an Agile software tool. It was fantastic. We could get out the backlog in there, all the stuff. We could refine stuff. We had visibility reports, but that's where it stopped. We didn't actually do all the other pieces of Scrum or Agile to follow those processes and get all the benefit. But we kind of stopped there and sold it that we are doing Agile, and hopefully they would accept that. But so it does come down to really doing it properly and getting the benefit by that. So
I think one other thing I'll just add on is that, this notion of responding to change, right? So people have selective memories, and I bet of all the things that executives, is that one phrase, responding to change, because all of a sudden now they have a lever. They go, oh, well, these guys, they're using a methodology that's all about change, tossing things in, and they'll adjust. And I think that idea of change management somehow gets lost, which is that respond to change, but there's a way you respond to change. I heard one company was telling me about that they were doing, they're fairly well versed in Agile and Scrum. They would get lots of top-down requests to add something or change something, but the release dates wouldn't change. And so it was kind of like, wait a minute, project management 101 went out the wind in theory. This was a mature group of people, and that notion really, I think, is a problem that people need to understand. What does responding to change really mean? It doesn't mean you can just keep adding more and more to the pipeline.
Yeah, and that's good, Saeed. So Neeha, the question I'm going to ask you is your team using Scrum? And if you were to ask, let's say, 4 different people on your team to define what Scrum was, do you think you would get 4 identical answers? In other words, how well do you think the method is understood and it's consistently implemented?
Yeah, definitely not. I don't think so. And I have fantastic developers. I mean, technically superb and very professional, really good communicators. So even with all of that, I don't think I would get a single answer as to what Scrum is. But I actually manage 2 teams, and one team is in Kanban and the other is in Scrum. And I think, I think Scrum is definitely a challenge. Actually, a question that I had is, I think I'm definitely in the situation that you mentioned, Lee, which is, I think we do Agile, we don't necessarily do it well. So what do you suggest for companies who are in this position where maybe they don't necessarily even know it, that they don't do it well, except for the Scrum Masters who definitely know that, we're not there yet. So what's the path to maturity without it being bogged down again by process? Because that's something that I don't want either. Maturity doesn't mean that, let's add, all of like more ceremonies, more, I don't know what the right words are, but I guess impediments to
overhead, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a great word, overhead.
Mm-hmm.
So I still like the flexibility. I still want to move fast. But what do you suggest in order to do Scrum better?
Yeah, I'd hire Saeed. Would be my first recommendation. But barring that, no. Again, I've done the full Scrum stuff. I mean, I've gone through. I've read the Sutherland's process. I personally don't think it's that heavy, to be honest, because all of the processes and ceremonies have very good purpose to me. So I would honestly review that as a team, and everybody read it and first of all agree to it and see if it does fit into your business and how you want to operate. But from the daily stand-up, where that means there's communication and you're helping each other, and someone might have an issue that they popped up and they can help. So I love that. I think 10 minutes is a great way to get things going. Refinement sessions where the product owner is digging into the problem with the team and can bring the market-facing issues to them, and learn about stuff that the team has. I remember always when I go to my refinement sessions, they'd blow me away with these questions I'd never thought about. So I think, following these processes, I personally think that they're fairly lightweight, but the value that they add is definitely worth it. But again, every company can be different, and the buy-in might not be there, or you may want to follow a different process. But so there's all that. Again, I think having Scrum Masters there and that are actually properly trained and really know how to follow Scrum, so it keeps on board. I mean, they're there to unblock things and keep the process well oiled, so to speak, right? So again, there's a lot of training aspects, but I am a Scrum believer. But I think just focusing on doing it well, but making sure it does match your business would take you a long way to being successful.
That's great. Thank you, Lee.
Good. Saeed, any comments there?
Yeah, so I think the reality of a lot of projects is that they start off poorly, right? So this idea of defining requirements without really a clear understanding of what's implied, I think that's a problem. I've seen a lot of examples of really wishy-washy requirements, right? And this is endemic. It's not something related to Scrum particularly or Agile. It's endemic that requirements are poorly defined up front. And a benefit of Agile approaches is that you don't have to define everything 100% up front. But the downside is that it lets you not do as much diligence as you should, with the assumption that it'll be done as part of the ongoing process. And I think that's a problem. And if you haven't defined your requirements really well and understood them really well, then your estimation process is not going to be be done very well. And I think that's a second factor, which is if we're estimating stories and you go, oh, well, this is 7 story points and this is 13 story points and this is whatever, you don't really know, right? It's relative sizes, but still, you don't really know. And I think that's the second part that a lot of people fall down on. I think once people get into development and they solve their problems and they figure things out, great. But then there's got to be some way to really backfill that so that you don't make those same mistakes again. And how do you do that? And I think a lot of that, people have retrospectives. Some data I've seen personally says that a lot of companies do retrospectives. They're not good at taking that insight and putting it back into the process and cleaning it up so that the next time they're significantly better, or there's a constant improvement process. Like, that's the ideal. I don't think it's the reality. So that'd be my comment on that.
If I want to jump back in, because I think that if you follow Scrum properly and you do it right, I mean, and I think you're bang on, by the way. I think it's very frequent that product managers don't actually define the requirements very well. But I view, from my experience, if you get in there and you work with a team, they'll come back with you with all these questions to define what it is you actually want. And using proper acceptance criteria, I mean, that's a huge part of writing a story, right? I mean, you can take courses on how to write a good story, and a key part of that is the acceptance criteria to define what it is you really want to deliver. So in my view, proper Scrum process, that refinement piece of it really nails down what that should be. And again, talking with Scrum Masters again, I think Scrum Masters, that is their job, to catch this stuff, and they're the ones who come back and make sure that the process is followed properly and fully, and enables those people to learn how to do things better, such that gets improved. So I think if you follow it properly, the benefit is there.
Sure, I think the benefit is there. I'm just saying that, and the assumption is you follow it properly and you do it well and you're well versed in it. I think if you take each one of those and you say, well, you're not following it really properly, you're not really great at it, you're not going through the process perfectly every time, you get to the point where that chaos report says fail without question, right? So I think people don't realize that focus on this, as much as it's people and interactions over process, there's a lot of process if you want to get a really good system going. I mean, it's kind of a misnomer to think process and get better at it.
Back to you quickly, Neeha. So what I'm interested in is, from my Scrum training, I've got my certified Scrum product owner. When you're on your team, your Scrum team, are you playing the role of the product owner? And my second question is, do you have a really strong Scrum Master? Because we've heard several times from Lee that that's really a critical key for success, is to have a strong Scrum Master. So maybe you can comment on those too.
Yeah, so I am playing the role of a product owner, and we do have Scrum Masters, but they're shared resources. So they are engaged, but not to the level where they can add this kind of value. It's constrained to resources. So I think we have again, it comes down to what I was talking about, right? We have Scrum Masters, but how embedded are they in the process? How are they monitoring? If the process is being executed properly? I don't know. I think right now at the level where we are, they're great at setting up the infrastructure to run a project in Scrum. So that they're definitely adding value in. And I think depending on the size, the maturity, the importance of the team, Scrum Masters tend to play a larger role there. Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. I think it just comes down to, I'm not sure how much organizations invest in having a product owner, a Scrum Master, potentially a project manager also, and then a BA. There's a lot of role definition issues. There's a lot of people focused on execution, and our company definitely has an issue in terms of role definition and overlap, which is I know a whole other topic, but if in my particular case, we have fantastic Scrum Masters, they're just not really able to help me out in the level that you're describing, which is implement it, truly learn from it. Our retrospectives, I don't know, I think the 15 minutes in the morning, that's the most useful thing. And in terms of grooming sessions, the bi-weekly grooming sessions, I actually feel like grooming happens more often, but it doesn't necessarily happen in that, that 1 hour that's booked bi-weekly. A lot of this stuff is definitely happening, but just in different ways for me personally. So would I like to improve the way that I'm doing things? Absolutely. But
yeah, well, that's why we like having your voice here, Neeha, because as we said in the previous podcast, or I think it was, or in a previous discussion with Steve Johnson, theory and practice are the same in theory, but often different in practice, and you're representing that view for us. So what I want to move on to next, folks, is Agile. So are there any basic comments to add on Scrum before we change the topic to how we scale Scrum to large enterprise endeavors or large enterprise software products? Okay. So let's transition to that. So Lee, do you want to kick us off in terms of, so how do you take this idea of Scrum, which it sounds like the statistics were saying works really well, the smaller the endeavor and the smaller the project? Are there any mechanisms to scale it up to larger projects, or does it fall down as the statistics seem to suggest?
Well, sure, yes. It definitely does fall down. The bigger projects get, inherently the harder they are to manage. But yeah, people have been looking at this, and there are various methodologies out there that people have come across. So a couple of big ones, again, I think, version 1 State of Agile report looked into this and has some stats that we can talk about here. There's a thing called Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFE. That's a very popular one. I think at 20%. Scrum of Scrums is another one that is just kind of really just scale Scrum itself. There's a couple others that people use out there. I've heard of DAD, which is Disciplined Agile Delivery. But again, a lot of these you can imagine have things like SAFE and DAD. I know them fairly well. Again, you look at their process charts, and it looks like, again, a big enterprise process solution, and it just seems to be, you're back to the enterprise project days, right, where there's a project management office and they've got their project plan, and away you go. It seems very similar. But people are working on it, and there are these methodologies that people are trying. I don't have any new data about that would talk about it. But again, it's the same kind of, you're trying to tame that elephant, again, this huge project with lots of moving pieces, and it just takes a lot of management and overhead to make that happen.
Saeed, what are your thoughts in terms of, is Agile and Scrum more specifically scalable to the enterprise level, or are we still trying to figure it out? Or
well, I think the data says we're still trying to figure it out, right? So the results are better for Agile projects that are large than Waterfall, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I think what Lee said is correct, right? It's a big beast, no matter what way you approach it, and whether you use one of these, scaled frameworks or something else, you're still going to have complexities, right? I once worked with a VP who always had this line, and it was one of these sort of truisms, but he would always, repeat it. And he says, in the end, everything turns out to be a people problem, right? And so, whether a server went down or something else happened, it was always, if you look at the root cause, is because someone didn't do their job right, and it was either an employee of the company or the person who made the thing or whatever. And I think that's the case here, right? If you're on a large project and you've got many teams and cross team dependencies, and there's change happening across teams, and there's unknowns across teams, you're going to have points of friction, and you're going to have to figure that out. And I think really what people are trying to do with these methodologies is remove risk, right? And in the end, if you can remove risk and lower it to an acceptable level, you can get a lot done. Lee and I were talking offline about this, actually. If you look back when President Kennedy way back said, by the end of the decade, we're going to go to the moon, it wasn't like they said, okay, on day one, we're going to start building the Apollo spacecraft. And in 1969, we're going to launch it, right? They programmed, which was, orbiting the Earth, and they had the Gen 2 guys up. And then they had several Apollo flights that kind of went up and went to the moon, but didn't land. And then finally they had, Apollo 11, where they land on the moon. And so, even without all this frameworks, excuse me, we were able to do amazing things, many years ago, but it just takes determination and focus and the right people. And when you look back at all these Apollo movies and the documentaries, and if you read any of the books, it always comes down to the teams were amazing. And I think that's really where you have to get to when you're working on large projects, is really make sure the teams are the right people with the right skills and the right focus. Yeah,
go ahead, Neeha. Any thoughts on that in terms of your environment? Are you guys trying to look at Scrum at the enterprise level, or is it more, no, each team has its own marching orders and they're using some other mechanism, the organization's using some other mechanism to tie all the different portfolios together?
Yeah, so the organization's looking at it, but I'm not sure there's a lot of buy-in. But in the interim, we are using a tool in Jira called Portfolio, which is not necessarily enterprise, but it's a small step towards getting a 360 view of all of the projects on the floor and introducing traceability. So what happens if a project moves? If, an epic moves because something else came in, so what is measuring the impact, measuring the change, and trying to quantify that and provide visibility are the goals that we're trying to address with Portfolio. And with my limited use of it, it looks good to me so far. Let's see where it goes. I'm not sure about SAFe. I was like, I don't think we're ready for it. And frankly, I want to stay away from it until there's a little bit more stability, for sure. And until I see evidence that this is something that I can execute. So we're talking about it, but I think we have bigger problems. But Lee, to your point about Polo and the moon, and I think this is also how entrepreneurs work, and especially being in a startup, I think this is partially also where like the top-down thing comes too, right? Which is you have these really great visionaries and entrepreneurs who really kind of know where we got to go, and sometimes that manifests itself in terms of like a big deal or a really clear like vision that this is where we're going, and then how it trickles down, we're at the same position that we were just talking about, right? And that may be I mean, it's amazing that they pulled it off, and I know that there were some failures in terms of the moon missions, but I don't feel like I'm in a very different position right now. So I think for sure that that all of those stories are like almost like a case study or a master lesson in project management or amazing execution, for sure.
Yeah, and as I would often say, to people, Neeha, that's why they pay you the big bucks, right? Because you're probably forging new ground and you're juggling chainsaws, as they say. So the research that Lee and Saeed have put together, you guys identified top 5 tips for success scaling Agile. Can we just go over those quickly? Maybe we'll start with you, Lee, or?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, again, this is the research done by, I think, the version 1 report. And they did research on a lot of companies, and the top 5 tips were, I think, number 1 was having internal Agile coaches. At 52, surprise, 52%. Executive sponsorship. So again, aligning, the top with the bottom throughout the structure was set at 48%. Consistent practice processes and practices. So again, I think just implementing things well was a third. And then implementation and common tools, and then having Agile consultants or trainers there. So to me, it all comes around a couple of things we've talked about by having those coaches and those experts there, making sure you're doing the process properly, having that alignment from top down and bottom up, and again, just making sure you're following the processes properly.
Yeah, and Saeed, do these 5, like if you were to ask to come up with your own personal list of 5, would it be the same, or does your experience, have any other tips for success on scaling Agile?
I think these are good. I think that, like, for example, consistent process and practices to me is critical, because if you're working with other teams but you're doing things completely differently, you're almost bound to get out of sync with each other. So to me, I mean, that practice is the middle one of the top 5. It's third out of 5. I would personally rate that much higher. But I think, having the coaches, making sure the executives are aligned, understanding that you have common tools and things is all there. The other thing I would say is that, and I'm, as you introduced me as, this metrics guy, I think having clear and understandable ways to measure what you're doing and then reinforce the improvements back into the process. I think that, scaling means growth. And you can't just grow without managing that growth in some way. And, it's that, n-dimensional problem. Like when you double the number of people, you quadruple the number of interactions and so on. And so I think that that's something that maybe it was number 6 on the list, but I think that's something that really needs to be understood and managed properly.
Yeah. So Neeha, maybe these are 5 things that you can, kind of take back to your team or take back to your leadership, in terms of ways of continuously improving. Are there any of these that you think that you're doing, very well, or any of these that you think that in your own day-to-day you'd like to work on more of the 5?
Yeah, I think all of them are great. And I absolutely, I think all of them to a certain degree, it's a work in progress. So great tips, and I'm definitely going to take them away.
So, I want to move to close pretty soon because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But to go back to your question about metrics, Saeed, I was really interested in looking at the research that you guys did here about this comment that you had about what should we measure, because I'll share with you a personal anecdote. I know when I was on recently on a Scrum team, velocity was like the only measurement, and that's all our Agile coach really ever talked about was velocity. I see that you've done some research there. What are your thoughts on metrics for, let's say, a product owner or a Scrum master? Is velocity the best metric, or are there others?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is no.
Okay. Surprise.
Well, but think about it. I mean, first of all, velocity is the wrong word. It's actually literally it's speed, right? Because velocity in physics means direction and magnitude, right? But in Scrum or in Agile, whatever you want to describe it, velocity is just it's unidirectional. It's just how many story points did you complete, and it doesn't really have. It says it's a scalar, from a physics perspective.
Like throughput, yeah.
Yeah, it's throughput, but it doesn't tell you anything about quality. It doesn't tell you anything about value. It doesn't tell you anything about anything, right? So it's like if I'm planning a trip and all I care about is the speed I'm traveling, how will I ever know if I'm ever getting to my destination, right? Or if I'm getting there at the right time or the right place or the right manner, etc. So I think it's the easiest to measure. Therefore, it's the one that's most commonly measured, but it's not the most valuable. And I think that when you think of things to measure, you want to think of things that can give you insight into the state of things so you can make them better, right? So velocity, you only want it to go in one direction, really, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Like whoever said, "Hey, I think we should slow down our velocity." Why? Well, I don't know, because we're not doing things right. Well, what are you not doing right? The kind of metrics you want to think about are things that help you make changes. So things like, are you meeting your plan in terms of what you planned, right? So it's not the velocity that you care about, it's the percentage that you're completing in the time that you allocate, right? It could be things like what's the amount of change that's happening during this process, right? Just because you completed 100 story points, it doesn't mean that those are the right things, because a lot of things might have changed. What about things that are being pushed? Just because I'm completing a lot of story points doesn't mean that I know things that are being pushed away because they couldn't get done.
Yeah.
Right. And then I mentioned quality earlier, right? That's another big one. I can get a lot of stuff done, but doesn't mean it's done right. So I think that people should really take a step back and say the things we want to measure are things that we can then use to identify problems and fix those problems. And there, the nice thing is there's a lot of them, right? You just have to figure out what are the right things for your group.
Lee Bonnell, I can hear you. I can hear you just wanting to jump in there. I imagine. So what are your thoughts on metrics? What should we be measuring, and is it measurable?
Sure. I mean, there's lots one can measure, and I like what Saeed was saying, because he was looking more at the overall business impact of what's happening beyond just purely a scaler. I like that term. But again, I think velocity is something that allows you to measure your relative improvement. Assuming that you are doing the proper level of quality, etc. A little aside here, though, I tried to get one of my teams or several of my teams to adopt the happiness metric. I don't know if you ever heard of that one.
No.
But yeah, there's a metric that I think Jeff Sutherland was trying to push, called the happiness metric, to see how happy your teams are, how it's changing, and why that may be or may not be.
That would be a disaster in my team.
Well, yeah, I like it, because I'm really curious as to how people are operating, how they're feeling, because I think that impacts their work. But again, it was a bit too touchy-feely for my teams, and they kind of rejected me pretty wholesomely. But
I think I'm going to try it. Lee, I think I'm going to try this.
Please, maybe you can succeed. I think it's a cool metric, but I over to you.
So Neeha, let's two questions for you. What kind of things are you measuring, or do you measure, or you or your Scrum Master or your organization? And then secondly, what kind of things would you like to measure that you're not currently measuring?
Well, I think, I'm definitely looking at throughput as well, but I've kind of divided up my project into, because again, very sensitive to go live date, stuff that absolutely has to get done, right? Like, so if this part is done, then I know that I'm sort of risk-free, regardless of how many story points there are. So I think that's there. But I think a more important aspect is how am I protecting my teams in terms of managing upwards? So because I'm in this position where sometimes I don't get to make decisions, I'm using my metrics to tell a story to my management. And I care about, that. So things like, okay, you want this done, but this is going to be the impact, So whatever I measure, unfortunately, maybe that's not necessarily the best, but it's like trying to build a case and trying to add some evidence to support, the message that I'm trying to, or the outcome that I want to accomplish. So I have a hidden agenda with the metrics that I want to measure.
Last topic I want to cover, and then I think we need to wrap up here, is what happens after Agile? Is there anything? And I'll start off with you on this one, Lee. Are we still chewing on Agile, or are the thought leaders out there seeing anything that's beyond Agile that might be the next big thing in terms of software delivery, project delivery?
Yeah, great question, Alan. And Saeed and I did some research on this to see what was next, if there was any big idea that was coming down the pipe that was exciting people. And there's lots of conferences and talks about beyond Agile, what's next, but really all of them come down to doing Agile better. For example, there's a book called Beyond Agile by somebody, but at the end of the day, if you read the summary, it's just doing Agile better and really going back to the base principles. There's actually a Beyond Agile manifesto, not surprising, I guess. You can find it at beyondagilemanifesto.org. So sure, people are looking at it. And again, they're just trying to refine it and build on it. But again, it's more an evolutionary thinking than revolutionary. Because I still think, Agile has quite a lot of legs and a lot of opportunity to keep improving. But that's kind of what I see at this stage. So evolution, but not revolution at this stage. So I'm not too sure if you have different thoughts, but
no, I think that's correct. I mean, Agile is pretty young, right? Let's be honest, right? If you think just from 2001, we're not even 2 decades in, and that's, it might be ages from a technology perspective, but from adoption and process and things like that, it's still very young. So I'd give it another 10 years at least before I throw it out.
Nice.
But I think the thing that's happened with Agile though over this last 15, 16 years is that a lot of dogma has really come into Agile. And, there's a lot of money as well, by the way, but a lot of dogma about, the right way of doing things, and the certain practices have to be done a certain way, and, you're that methodology. And I think finally, and I've been anti-dogmatic for a while, but I think a lot of the Agilists now are sort of, bringing that to light and talking about it. And, I was watching a video online by Dave Thomas, who's also one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. And his first slide is in the talk is Agile is dead. And then he kind of explains what he means. And in the end, he says, look, I'm pro agility. I'm just anti-agile dog. And I think that's really comes down to, let's get back to the pragmatic aspects of what was originally envisioned and, do what's right as opposed to do what we're told. And I think, it's kind of ironic that this philosophy of working that seemed to be top-down management has turned into something that, whether people agree with it or not, is kind of top-down managed. And so I think that's really where some of the change will happen, and hopefully it happens for the better, the change.
Yeah, I can identify with that.
Yeah. So sorry, Neeha, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to refer back to one of your earlier comments, Neeha, which was, it sounded like what you were describing is if we're not careful, we can add a lot of overhead, to the process, and we're just going through the ceremonies, quote unquote, because the book says that we're supposed to do them, and maybe we lose a little bit sight of the pragmatism. I like Saeed's word there. So what's your thought in terms of the practice that you've seen? Is there a lot of kind of ceremonies just for the sake of ceremonies, or do people more operate day to day just with the principles in mind and don't get too caught up and too dogmatic, as Saeed's saying?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I think for us, there's just no time, right? So we're just doing whatever it takes to get through, and I think we're just adopting the minimum amount required to get through, and it's going to be a continuous improvement. Yeah, there's definitely not enough time to really execute, or at least maybe my concept of, Agile completely. But when Lee was speaking, I absolutely identify with that, which is going back to first principles, right? When I just look at first principles, it makes 100% sense to me. And, when Lee speaks about, these are the things that work, I'm like, yeah, it makes absolute logical sense, So I feel like if I go back to first principles, and this is definitely going to work for me, it's just, the real life situation is just slightly different, but it's a huge takeaway for me, from this conversation, which is to go back, look at some of the first principles, look at like what I can do better, what's not working, and reassess, because I think that is also not happening right now. We're just in this flow, and where's that opportunity to reassess? And certainly it's not happening in my retrospectives. It's not happening given the chaos of planning, not planning, top down, all of that, right? It's just the machine is working. So what can I actively do in order to change the machinery, for my teams at least, I think was a takeaway for me from this conversation.
Well, let's move to wrap it up. So I want to thank you, Saeed, Lee, and Neeha. And what I want to do is give you each the opportunity. If somebody's listening to this podcast episode and they're intrigued by something that you say, they want to follow you or learn more, let's just go around the virtual table here. Saeed, is there any contact information or blog or website that you want to share with the audience in terms of how they can kind of follow you and maybe get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So on Twitter, I'm Saeed W. Khan, SaeedWkhan, or they can contact me through my company, transformationlabs.io.
Cool. And Lee, what about yourself?
Transformationlabs.io for myself as well.
And Neeha, you're not obligated to share anything, but if you wanted to, you can, or you can try to stay anonymous, whatever your preference is.
No, I mean, I don't have anything to share, but if people want to get in touch with me, LinkedIn,
Okay.
It's Neeha Thumala. So I'll put that, in this podcast someplace at the bottom.
Awesome.
So they can find me. But guys, I'm still thinking about those moon missions, and I was wondering, what do you think, if that team was there today, what do you think they would adopt?
Nice
or I don't know,
question.
the current moon missions teams.
Or Mars, how about that?
Or Mars, yeah.
What methodology should we use? That's a good question.
Well, can we ask Elon Musk what he's doing? Because that's the guy that's doing it, right?
Really like to know.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah.
That would be probably a great experiment. I bet you if we put out a post on LinkedIn with that title, is Elon Musk using Agile to get to Mars? I think we'd get a ton of views. What do you guys think? Maybe we should fabricate something just as an experiment.
I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
I don't personally have Elon's email or anything reach out to him on LinkedIn or something, see if we can get
He
some comment
responds
going
on
that.
Twitter.
Does he? Oh, great.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, listen, thank you again, all. I want to respect your time. Thank you for your time. And, another great discussion. And I'm sure we'll look forward to many more.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. It was fun.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See you guys.
You can find us on the web at www.productmanagementshow.com and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The PDM Show. That's THEPDMSHOW.
Gee, mate, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
Thank you for listening to the Product Management Show. If you enjoy the show, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.